Hey everyone, this is Latin Entertainment, and my name is Francisco Escobar. Welcome to season 4 of Conversamos, and get ready as we have a great panelist of 5 generations of Mexican immigrants to discuss about immigration, their relation to the US, and family history. With our first question, what is your relevance to multi-generational immigration?
So my parents brought me here, my mom and my stepdad back in the 90s. So even though I didn't know, what everything that I was going to experience, it's definitely left a mark. And now it's kind of hard to, to kind of understand if I belong here in the States or if I belong in Mexico. I was born in Ciudad Juarez, and I lived there when I was 19 for a couple years, and I definitely felt out of place. What do I look forward to gaining this convo? Definitely, learn from other perspectives. By now, since the last time that I returned, which was 12 years ago in 2008, I came with the idea that I belong here. I grew up in Anaheim, so I consider myself an Anaheimer. I know that word doesn't exist, but that's how I see myself. And as an activist, I know that the things that I want to fight for are here in my community. Right now, I'm actually in Santa Cruz. I just moved last weekend. I'm about to start my PhD. So part of my research interests are going to revolve around the issues that undocu and underrepresented students go through, especially in Southern California and especially in Anaheim. So I want to learn from other people's perspectives so I can include that also in my growth and in my research.
Hi there. So my name is Michelle Villegas Threadgold. I'm a second generation Mexican American. I've done a lot of writing as a journalist about different Latin American resistant art movements. And I contributed to a book called Women Who Rock. And part of that project was to get more Latino representation in a book that's sort of about like American, history in terms of rock music. But I made sure that all of the different people who contributed to American rock music who were Latino were represented. And I've also just sort of been very interested in movements of resistance in general. And it's something I've documented a lot, written about like the first Latino film festivals and stuff like that. More recently, I've been working on a project called Broken Borders that takes real interviews I've done with people who have survived deportation centers and have sort of experienced the worst elements of our broken border. And I've sort of incorporated them into a long book of poetry. And so for me, I think the subject is really of interest to me because the subject of borders and how they divide us, but particularly how we can cross them within our own communities, is of interest to me.
Thank you so much. And yes, now Daniel.
Hi, my name is Daniel Reese. I think when it comes to my relevance to the topic, I would use the word ignorant. Growing up along the Texas-Mexico border at South Texas, I'm surrounded by Latinos. 99, 98% of the population is Latinos. And while a huge amount may be undocumented or resident status, all those different statuses, because we're all Latinos and because we're mostly Mexican American or Mexican of Mexican origin, I think the topic of status doesn't really come up, and I really didn't start having conversations about that until college when I just joined the fraternity, Phi Beta Alpha, and that's really what kind of reconnected me to my origins. So I think growing up, I was extremely ignorant and saw myself more as an American than I did as a Mexican, even being so close to the border. So from this conversation, I really just hope to get more perspectives, because that's literally what the last 6-7 years of my life has been. It's just really trying to re-ground myself back in my origin, as well as hearing people's stories and seeing just how this immigration system of America really impacts people. Because I think for the longest time, I had no idea the magnitude of the issue that we face.
Thank you, Daniel. And I really appreciate your honesty, which I think is like really important for all of us to like really consider. Because, if we can't be honest with ourselves and each other, then who really can be honest with? So I really appreciate that. And then next, Paul.
Yeah. So hello, my name's Paul Martinez. I am originally from San Antonio, Texas. I am a fourth generation American, Mexican American. So I I have a interesting just story because I'm the fourth Paul Martinez. So my great-great-grandfather was an immigrant to this country from San Luis Potosi. And it kind of gets interesting because in San Antonio, my grandparents experienced an amount of discrimination to the point that language wasn't a priority for teaching my parents. When even changing the pronunciation or the spelling of my name, the original Paul is actually named Pablo. And so part of that assimilation and part of that story of seeming like a normal American was changing the name from Pablo to Paul. And that has really stuck with me because even my grandmother, who was a third generation American, was fighting for the rights of her community and still dealing with racism in Antonio, that had to deal with the symptoms of that racism indirectly without my knowledge, without my even consent, right?
So I'm a fifth generation Mexican American. I was born in West Texas, grew up in the Midwest, and currently reside on the East Coast. I think the relevance to this topic for me is I have the unique, my family has a unique story in such that we were actually Mexican when Utah was Mexico. And we have joked often that we didn't cross the border crossed us. And it's a real thing for us. So my family went from like the Salt Lake area and ended up in the Rio Grande Valley. And tried to figure out like where this border was, and became American, I think, because they were on a certain side of the border. I have a great grandfather who fought alongside Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa was the godfather to his daughter. I have that in my family, and growing up having originated in Texas and growing up in the Midwest, I had a very Mexican migrant kind of centric viewpoint of what it meant to be Latino. I also joined Phi Iota Alpha, and my knowledge of Latino history was greatly expanded. And then I moved out to Philadelphia to study grad school, and had the opportunity to meet more Latinos that weren't just Mexican, and really got to diversify and understand more diversity in the Latino experience. And so I really hope to get out of the conversation really this idea that we talk a lot about coming together as Latinos, but really what does it mean to create Black and Brown coalitions to really help us affect positive change and really fight for our civil rights together as a much larger group. And it's something that in my work, I work in communities of color, and I've always worked to find ways to really combine the advocacy and the voice of both the Black and Brown community in concert with each other to really help amplify our causes and fight for the rights of all minorities, not just Latinos, and to fight for so like I said, fight for everybody's right, because I think that as long as we're doing that, we'll rise together.
What generation of immigrant are you, and what is your or your family's U.S. immigrant story?
I would be first generation immigrant. My mother from Ciudad Juarez and my stepdad from Querétaro. We moved from Juarez to Querétaro, and then after a couple years, they decided to move north. I was brought to the U.S. In September of 1994 when I was 11. And obviously at that age, I didn't have any say in the matter. I wasn't given any options. but now I understand why my mom and my stepfather decided, to do this. Although, like I mentioned, I'm from Ciudad Juarez. We had moved to Querétaro back in the late '80s, and when we moved to Querétaro, the first place we lived at was in a rancho called La Piedad, and then in a pueblo called Amialco. I was about 6 years old. I still have a lot of fond memories from there. And then to a city called San Juan del Rio Querétaro, where I lived there like in 3 different homes. From there, back in '94, that's when the transition. Politics plays a role, obviously Mexican politics. So that's when the transition from Carlos Salinas de Gortari to Cedillo takes place. That's when the peso loses 3 zeros. That's when lack of jobs. That was one of the big issues. So my stepdad, being a resident by then of the U.S., he suggested maybe we should come to California, and that's what we did. Risking it all. And there was a separation. I came with my stepdad and my young brother, who's a U.S. citizen. So I was the one, that they had to find ways to get me in. And then about 18 months later, my mom and my 2 sisters followed suit.
I'm second generation. My mother is from, I'm biracial, and my mother is from Mexico City. And so, she kind of, when she migrated here, it was a lot of it had to do with, the economic circumstance and exactly kind of what was highlighted earlier of just sort of like the collapse. And so, her becoming a, resident had to do with Reagan's amnesty. And so that's sort of how that happened, which is very unique and interesting, and actually explains a lot of why there is a conservative strain amongst many Latinos. It's sort of like giving undue respect or praise for something that only privileged a very unique set of people. So that's part of the immigrant story. But yes, so I was the first person to graduate from college in my family, and I'm sort of the first person to, have a white collar job. So
I think for me, like I said, I'm 3rd generation from Mexico. Most of my grandparents or great grandparents crossed from right across the border. So Tampico, Tamaulipas, Nuevo Laredo, that area. So not like there was a huge migration. It's usually just kind of that small border crossing. And they went through the process. They got their status, I guess, a traditional way. They applied for the green card, got the residency status. So I know back then, I'm assuming it was a lot more lenient. I've never really delved into their story. So I think for me, it's just really growing up. I never considered myself an immigrant or I guess like a child of immigrants, because my family came from education. Both my grandparents had college educations and had, I guess, white collar jobs. So while I've heard snippets here and there about having to farm or having to migrate, it wasn't like it had this huge impact on us. And especially for me growing up, I never would have claimed that was my life story, or that I had a hard life growing up. So for me, that's why I've always identified very much American, because I feel like they led that charge on that portion of my history. And so for me, it's never been like super where I can recall what they went through, or I can say like I experienced what they went through with hardships.
Very good. Thank you, Daniel. And Paul?
Yes. So I am a 4th generation American, and for me it gets a little muddled because my great-great-grandparents all have different stories. Some of them immigrated to the United States. Some of them were already here, where, like mentioned earlier, the border crossed them. But primarily I would say in my young adult life, I had to really rediscover what the immigrant story was for my family. We came from Guanajuato, San Luis Potosí. I've heard stories of my great-grandfather on my mother's side who acted as a guide to bring over his siblings to the United States to work on the way of better opportunities. But I didn't necessarily identify with their experience because I didn't really have any frame of reference for what they went through. It's a little hard to understand their experience in all of this, but it became the ties to Mexico became less and less as the generations went on. My parents didn't have as strong of a tie. They didn't go as many times to Mexico as much as my grandparents did when they would go on trips and vacations. And it became even less for me. I only started going to Mexico when I started dating an immigrant. And that was my reconnection with my identity as a Latino, my identity as a fourth generation American. So I definitely have it further and further, at least generationally for me, it gets a little bit more complicated. The story gets a little bit more muddled, and there's just a lot of stories to listen to and to internalize.
Thank you, Paul. And Chris?
Yeah, so my story is very similar to Paul's in respect to getting muddled. The generations that lived not in the U.S. have long passed, and so the stories that I'm hearing are now stories of stories of stories, and so it's harder to kind of get through what's what. But like I said earlier in my introduction, from what I can gather, the family at some point we had one of the great grandfathers came over from Spain. He was a de la O. There was very much that elitist background, and he married a Mexican woman. And so the kids were criollos, and and this idea that this is who we are. But the colorism, the prejudice against darker skinned individuals runs deep in my family, and I think that it's born out of that experience from Spain, and this is what we were taught. But at the same time, when I look at my own journey growing up, I grew up very poor, and so I have some of that like poverty type experience, but it's not necessarily Latino outside of some of the food, and my mom and her sisters speaking the language. So like I said, I mean, I had in the family, there were bootmakers and fought alongside Pancho Villa and Godfather and all of this stuff. And then we come to where we are now, and I have my family in California and Texas and Illinois. And it's like, we're all over the place now. Myself, I'm part of the generation that have started to expand our educational attainment. And so my generation, my cousins are the ones that are getting college degrees and advanced degrees with hopes that we can push our kids even further.
Thank you, Chris. And now my next question for everyone is, how do you view the current the immigrant system today?
Yeah, this is something that by now I kind of get it, that it's really not going anywhere. I've been living for over 20 years. I've been living in limbo ever since, the moment I got here to, going back to Mexico and then residing here again since 2008. I see it that it doesn't matter whether Republicans or Democrats are in charge. We're really not going to get a solution on this, I think unless people really rise up and organize. The current system, I believe, is meant to appease the few that do engage in grassroots and political activism. And this is meant to provide kind of like a superficial solution through programs like the H1, H2 visas, DACA, and TPS. And especially, I would like to talk about DACA real quick, because now what I've noticed in the news is anytime that we're talking about undocumented folks, the focus goes to DACA, the focus goes to dreamers. I'm a dreamer myself, but I don't have DACA. I was denied back in 2013. So it's not like, because I don't have it, I think it's not a real solution. No, at the end of the day, whenever we hear Congress say, dreamers, we're going to find a solution for dreamers, Trump is, thinking about removing DACA and then providing something new. But then when we send of the 11 million plus of undocumented folks that live in this country, so the last numbers when DACA came through, there were about 700,000 dreamers with DACA. That number has now gone down to 652,000. And it's probably going to continue going down, with folks not having the money, folks being in fear. Now I think it's very clear that folks, we need to come together, regardless of where we're from, and especially those that are already a citizen or have a legal residency. We need to actually engage to pressure Congress, starting with our local officials, to take action so we can pass a comprehensive, inclusive immigration reform at the federal level.
Kind of just echoing what was said. I mean, I think the system is completely broken. I think it completely, privileges those who are rich and have access to and who can afford high-priced lawyers. And everyone else is sort of left to fend for themselves with the very limited, cap of how many immigrants are allowed in. I think there's an opportunity to create a lot more programs for different types of workers that we need. I think there's just a lot of necessity there to make it possible for a pathway for citizenship. And, on a purely capitalistic level, American entrepreneurship has been on decline since the 60s. And the only people kind of creating jobs for Americans, starting businesses, are actually immigrants. And so if we, even from a capitalistic sense, it makes sense. And so I just, it's broken, needs reform.
Thank you for your honesty, Michelle. Most definitely.
I think from my point of view, something that I've always kind of led by is I don't like to speak where I'm not informed. So I'm not going to go into this and talk like I know what I'm talking about. I think from a very broad point of view, I agree with Michelle that it's extremely broken. From what I've observed and from what I've read about, from the little research I've done, it definitely tends to favor European immigrants as opposed to Latin American immigrants. And that's something that I think we've seen a lot when it comes to it. So I definitely think the system is broken. It's not working. And the past 2-3 years that we've had Trump as president, I think I've really began to see those effects in my hometown, because before, being a border town, being 20 minutes away from the border, never really meant anything to me. But when we started to see it get militarized these past couple of years and see a lot more presence of Border Patrol and Customs and all of those law enforcement agencies, I think that really is what made it a reality for people in the Valley. So I think for me, I think just in a summary, broken is the word I would use, because like Ellie and Michelle have resonated, it's a system that's meant to say that, we do have a system, but it's obviously not working. It's backlogged. It's leading to these deaths, these murders, injustice throughout the entire system. So I think it's just something that needs to definitely be not only reformed, but maybe completely remade, because it's whatever is in place, whether it's new or old, is not working.
The current immigration system was designed only to pay lip service to the idea that this country was founded by immigrants. Yeah, I just think that the system is designed to only let a few people in. The people who designed the immigration system weren't former immigrants, weren't people who immigrated to this country. It's designed by people who, it's not in our hands. And because it's not designed and influenced and doesn't have the same values that immigrants have, it's always going to be lacking. It's always going to be ineffective at really doing its job of vetting people, of allowing people to immigrate to this country in a documented fashion. And I think it really does need to be either abolished or a new system be created in its place, because we need the influence of the people who have gone through that process, who understand what the process of being an immigrant and coming from another country to this country. And I think if we include those people in the design, in the value system of what we're creating, I think it really could be successful. But in its current design, it's not going to allow it's only going to allow people who have money, who have success, who have generational wealth.
Thank you, Paul. And Chris?
Yeah, no, I agree with, I find myself agreeing especially with Paul, but yeah, I don't think the system is broken necessarily. I think it's unjust. And I think that it is working exactly as it's been designed to work, right? To have a backlog, to frustrate people, to keep people on the list. Like, I think that that's where the justice piece comes in, and those who have designed it have not designed it in the framework of justice. And so I think that's where it falls apart. I mean, when you look at, the great migrations from European countries, there was a system set up where people could come to Ellis Island and go through what they needed to go through, but eventually they would get processed and released into cities, right? Like we saw that all up and down the East Coast. And I think, we're not seeing that along our southern border. Like, why aren't we seeing intake centers in San Isidro and El Paso and, in the Texas Valley? Like, why aren't we seeing these intake centers where people we can get the information quicker now than we could have in the early 20th century? But we're not. And I think that's where that justice part comes in, because it's designed to keep people from Central and South America out of this country. And I think that's a shame. And, and I'm thankful that my family ended up here the way we ended up here. But like, man, even though I'm hearing stories and I know people personally who have been trying to wade these waters of the immigration system, and they've been in the queue 18 years. I mean, that's ridiculous, and it's unjust. And I think that's where we really have to come down to. We need to reframe this through justice.
Oh, I don't think any of us think it's working. I think the reason that the phrase broken is in reference to the system. So the system is broken, not in terms of, and of course, you can easily argue that it was designed that way. Absolutely. And you can also talk about how it was also evolved that way. You can talk about how Homeland Security happened and the huge, impact that had on immigration. And then you can also talk about, for example, the question that you asked later, which is about, ICE, how that's changed, how the way that we deport people has changed, and it's become more and more fascistic. But, that's the basic question, like, does it work for some people? Yes, it works for the privileged people who have tons of money, who have companies that Google can sponsor, like all of these kinds of things. These are people who can afford that. It works for white Brazilians. It works for people who are affluent and well-heeled. That's the only people I would say it works for.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It definitely works for corporations, transnationals that can also use the visa H1, H2 visas, and then bring other folks from other countries with the skills required. But, they're paying them that less. And then the people here locally in the U.S., with the same type of skills, now they're shut out from those opportunities, because they would need to earn more in order to continue to live, in their local area per se. I definitely don't, I can agree that it's broken. It was designed that way. And just last semester, I was taking a Chicano studies class, and where I learned that this public charge, this idea of the public charge started around 1918 or something. So that's when they came up, the Department of Immigration per se, and just to see that they have continued to use this angle, this idea for over 100 years, but now they really target it to specific people. What country are you coming from? If you come from Mexico or if you come from Philippines, then you're gonna have to wait over 10 years to adjust your status.
With our next question, how do you view ICE and Border Patrol in relation to the immigrant community, and why? And if anyone saw the Immigrant Nation documentary that just appeared on Netflix and want to share a little bit about that as well, feel free.
I haven't watched the documentary, but that's next on my list, actually. But the way that I view ICE and CBP, I view them as agencies that are meant to instill fear, in undocumented folks and threaten their existence as well. they do this while ignoring the fact that Congress is not doing any, taking any direct action to, again, to fix the system, to pass, say, a comprehensive immigration reform. So these agencies, they basically exist to inflict pain, to cage people, to set a tone that outsiders are not welcome unless, you're European descent. And if in case you still, choose to try to come to the U.S., that you will suffer and that you will regret it.
Yeah, I agree with Eli that ICE and CBP have been built to be scary, like to scare communities, to scare our community. And I think like just look at the way that they act sometimes with impunity, right? Like in our cities, here in Philadelphia, we've heard stories of people living in churches, seeking protection and not being able to leave the physical building for years because the minute they step out, ICE is going to grab them. Like that's not, that is meant to instill fear into the community and to make an example of people, because those are the stories that get told, right? And so like, I think by and large, especially with ICE, but even with CBP, like we see that with the law enforcement community often is, even though it's here to protect and serve, that we really see that it's really a vehicle for white supremacy culture to continue to instill its superiority over communities of color. Right. And so I think that in a very real way, ICE and CBP act as those vehicles over Latinos and those coming through our southern borders.
Like I said, kind of growing from what Chris said, where he mentioned the church, I think what we see in the Rio Grande Valley, and that's what I'm focusing on because that's my area, the Rio Grande Valley in itself becomes a church because we're the only area that has border patrols on our northern border and our southern border. So people who are able to cross over, if they do it illegally, are literally confined to this small area of the United States, because in order to get past the northern border checkpoint, you have to go through another round of CBP border patrol agents. So I think that in itself creates this little pockets of poverty, this pockets of inequality that we're seeing. And as you've been following the news, the Rio Grande Valley is getting hit hugely with the coronavirus, with Hurricane Hannah, because there's a huge disparity in income, in education, in health. So all these aspects are essentially kind of, I don't want to say because solely of these agencies, but because these populations have been confined to this area, it's so dense in all of these disparities that it leads to this huge difference in the rest of the country. And you see it when it comes to health, to education, to wealth. I mean, we tend to go off the charts compared to the normal rates across the country. And I think that is because we're confined to such a small space, because those people that do come here face that issue. And a lot of times what you see is that you have family members who become the anchors. So you may have a child who is a legal citizen, but their parents aren't. So then that child becomes anchored here because of the parents, and it just becomes kind of an effect that just kind of continues to trickle down. So I think it's little issues like that. I think it's definitely instilled fear. And what we're also seeing is that there's more of a recruitment of Hispanics to these agencies to try and justify that we're not a white supremacy organization, or that we're not a racist organization because we employ Latinos. So then you start to have this whole idea of Latinos who are attacking Latinos, and it gets into a whole other area of like people of the same ethnic group attacking each other. So I think it's led to this whole mess in the Rio Grande Valley.
And to make undocumented immigrants feel like they do not belong here, like they are truly aliens in this country. And I think it only drives them into the shadows. It ensures that they don't want to participate, or that they're not able to fully participate in the system. The not wanting to come forward to the police when a crime occurs is an issue. if communities don't feel safe to bring up issues that are going on, to intervene with larger concerns, larger problems that are existing that they see, then we really have a deficiency in our knowledge of how we're policing communities and how we are managing communities and how communities are able to manage themselves. With undocumented people unable to access either resources, to come forward for crisis intervention, for all of the resources that white suburbs are allotted, it allows these communities to kind of continue to spiral downward in a way, because they're not able to access the bigger systems. They're not able to participate in the sense of just receiving benefits or actively participate by giving, even just tax dollars. Both of these agencies are designed to make people feel alienated in a country that they might have called their home all of their lives. And I believe that is just morally wrong. These people don't want to destroy or bring problems to any nation. I think families and individuals just want to be able to provide for themselves, provide for their families, put a nice meal on the table. And I think these agencies are designed to break up these families, break up activists, break up organizers, take people and leaders from these communities and disenfranchise them and truly cripple them so that they're not able to advocate for themselves and they are not able to advocate for change.
Mm. And I'm actually going off that. What U.S. systematic changes would you like to see in the next 5 years?
I mean, wow, there's just there's so much. I would like to say that I really kind of agree with what everyone had sort of said before me, and also just wanted to acknowledge one quick thing, which is just that under Trump, several things changed, included the way that people are deported, so that there's no system between, like, if you've created a felony or if you have a fake green card, you're all the same if you're caught by CBP. And as a result, there are many families being broken. There are many people taking inspiration from, like, Piao and his raids and doing stuff like that to, like, hold people hostage and really kind of have them live in terror. So when it kind of comes to the systematic changes that I'd really like to see happen, some of these programs, like, really extend beyond the Latino community, but would create great change for the Latino community. So things like creating programs to help single moms, providing daycare so that they can either further education or continue, having, like, something towards a trade, free healthcare, free college education. I mean, all of these things would completely restructure society and change the way that, like, culture is. These are all just, like, some simple things that seem like basic human rights. And then, another thing is they're just a pathway towards immigration. So those are some things that would be lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to pick up with what Michelle said, definitely passing immigration reform. I just wanted to share real quick that after finishing high school, I did not go to college. And I actually started my jornalero career at 15 and then continued it to the early 2000s. So I experienced a lot of, the different experiences that true jornaleros, folks that go day to day looking for work there. So what I would be waiting there, it hit me like, what's their future? A lot of them just decided to go back to their country because they didn't have job stability and their prospects of fixing their status were basically null. So for me, I became an activist back in 2012, and my main goal was to help pass comprehensive immigration reform, not only for myself, but again for the rest of the individuals that have been here even longer than I have, and they still don't have a path to adjust their status, much less become a citizen. Additionally, I've been involved with, one, it would be passing comprehensive immigration reform before we work on any other programs, because you can, like here in California, you can provide all the kind of help, but at some point, you're still going to need to be documented. Secondly, I've been involved with education attainment, so just supporting students of color be able to complete, their college access, requiring ethnic studies at the high school and college level, and also engaging in practice and authentic caring.
I think this idea of Pan Americanism to really be adopted fully by all of the countries in the hemisphere, right? And like really, um, I mean, this is almost pie in the sky, kumbaya, but like really working together to strengthen the continents, both north and south, um, and bring all countries, you know, rise together. I mean, again, that's very pie in the sky. That's very like, you know, way out there. But I think like I would love to see um, more than just trade deals that, you know, free trade or fair trade or whatever have you, but like really intentional partnerships with countries. And I think I would also like to see, and this comes back to more of the U.S. systemic change, but like to see the U.S. take less of a front seat, because I think whenever we as a country get involved, we tend to ruin it for everybody else because we're only looking out for our own self-interest, right? And so like I think I'd love to see more of this idea of in a global economy as a hemisphere, we can do more together than we can do separately.
Okay, yeah, sure. I think Chris brought up some good points. Something that comes to mind more immediately would be just sort of like the villainization of people who are from Central America or Southern America migrating to Mexico. I would really like to see AMLO stop villainizing people like that, and also to prevent, just like we've been talking about the caravan, Mexico and many of the media run from Mexico has also sort of characterized the people exactly how we characterize Latinos coming for a better opportunity. So I would really like to see that end, and I would like to have more open borders between nation states. I mean, that's something I would hope could happen.
I think number one, abolish ICE. That is without a doubt requirement. It's not helpful in any way. It's about dumping people. It's about criminalizing them and policing them and threatening them. That's my number one policy that needs to happen. And number two, I think the US needs to acknowledge the effects and the influence that they've had throughout Latin America and the way that they have either disenfranchised, destabilized people in these nations, and even our demands as a capitalistic country, that the more that we want and want to take and take and take, it has to come from somewhere. And the closest land and resource place is Latin America. And the more that we just want, the more that these countries want to provide. And they, in turn, start to disenfranchise their own indigenous communities. So in terms of Latin America, I would say empower indigenous communities. They understand how to take care of the environment, to work with the environment and such.
Thank you for sharing that. Daniel?
I think I'll answer the Latin America systemic changes. I think when I look at current events and things that I've seen, I know LGBTQIA rights in Latin America are huge, as well as women rights. I know there's protests currently going on in Mexico where there's just violence against women simply because of the Latin American culture and heritage, where it's just machismo, and that also affects the LGBTQIA populations where those aren't seen. So I guess systemic rights in terms of human rights as an umbrella, but focusing a lot on those two populations, which is the women's rights and LGBTQIA. I think also the environment, especially in like Brazil, where you have the forests and all those issues going on. There's a lot of environmental issues that needs to be addressed in Latin America. And now whether that stems from a lack of education on the topic or whether that just stems from ignorance, I'm not sure what the reasoning is. But I think human rights and environmental changes are two big things that I think, honestly, both US and Latin America could really focus on. Because I think we've been set back.
For our next question now, what advice would you like to share to fellow immigrants of your generation?
I think from my generation, or those who are in my generation, I think it's important to remember that just because we may be seemingly far removed from the initial immigrant experience does not make us less immigrants, right? Like I think we can be American and we can be Mexican, or we can be, whatever country our nationality is. I think that's important, and I think we should continue to have pride in that, but also understand that having been born in the U.S. affords us a measure of privilege that we need to leverage for those of our family and our, to really push for changes that they may not be able to, right? And so, like, let's use whatever small amount of privilege that we have to really push civil rights for our fellow Mexicans, or those who are undocumented, or why aren't we putting our effort into fighting to reunite families? And like, these are the things that we need to think of, because there's no way ICE is showing up at my door to send me home, because my home is in Texas, right? Like, that's where I was born. So you want to send me back to where I came from? Send me to Texas. Not that that's where I want to live, but I'm sorry, that's a bad joke. Anyway, but my point is, like, we need to understand that just because we don't have to fight for us or our kids or our immediate family, like, we still have family, right? And we need to continue that fight until justice and equality is shared by all.
Yes, I definitely agree with what Chris was stating. I would suggest, to get involved, starting locally, demanding our local officials to represent the will of the people. And I was pulling up some data here. And one example, like, what is the will of the people? Well, current polls show that over 80% of Americans polled support a path to citizenship for dreamers. So you're polling Americans, and they're saying, yes, let's work on making them legal per se. But then you have Congress, dragging their feet or tossing the ball back and forth and not getting anything done. On another poll, over 50% of those polls support legalizing the over 11 million undocumented folks. So here we have, a majority of the population saying, at least in those polls, from those that were polled, yes, let's take action. Let's fix this problem once and for all, Yet Congress is not listening, is not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So I think organizing locally, political activism is definitely in effect. I mean, that needs to happen. And secondly, I would also suggest to remember the things that were gained thanks to, the different movements, of the 50s and 60s, well, 60s especially, the Chicano movement, the civil rights movement, the LGBTQ movement, and others. And if we remember, what was gained, what folks back then were fighting for, and what from those things, what things we still have, and where do we want to go from there? Because obviously, if we don't protect what was gained before, obviously those in power are looking to take that back. We're going to have to fight for the same thing. So definitely is engage locally and know your history in a way.
My advice that I'd give to any immigrant is to find community, find supporters, find people that are willing to invest in you. Not necessarily in terms of money, but in terms of knowledge, in terms of time, in terms of love and support. The process is difficult and challenging, and there are many trials and tribulations, but community is really what brings you together, and experience that they can provide context, they can provide insight, they can provide avenues of resources and who to discuss and who to talk to. And I think that's important. I think passing on that knowledge from community member to another person who needs it is extremely vital. And I think it keeps us connected with the people that we're living with, the people that surround us.
I think I'll kind of close this off then. So I think for me, what came to mind hearing Chris and Eli talk was the movie Selena, when the dad's saying being Mexican American is hard because you have to prove to the Mexicans that you're more Mexican than American, and to the Americans that you're more American than Mexican. I think being in that second, third, fourth generation kind of window, you're in a very pivotal moment to where it's up to you to hold on to your roots, to your heritage, but also look to your future as an American citizen, and as you continue your progeny, that's going to continue to get farther and farther away from your culture. So I think my advice is really everyone else mentioned, kind of figuring out your identity, and then being confident in that identity and moving forward with it. I'll be honest with me, my Spanish is horrible, and I've seen posts where everyone criticizes people who are Mexican who don't speak Spanish. And while I understand it's a part of my heritage, I wasn't taught it growing up because my parents and their grandparents were punished for speaking Spanish. So for me, I wasn't taught it more as we're going to prevent you from being scrutinized in school, not as we're ashamed of our heritage. So I think for me, it's really, I've had to come to terms with that. That while I understand it and I can piece it together, I'll never be fluent in Spanish, and that's okay because I still know my heritage. I know where my lineage has come from. I know their struggles, and like we say, my family struggles are my struggles. And while I may not have experienced it firsthand, it's a part of my blood and my culture. So I appreciate it for what it is, and I have to use those stories and use their dreams for me to move forward and move our people forward.
Cool. And so right now we have actually a first generation, a third generation, and a fifth generation immigrant and American. And so I'm really interested now on what your views of assimilation, kind of like Daniel kind of brought forward, as well as integration.
I think in my generation, it's seemingly easier to assimilate, right? And so, like in my family, we've lost a lot of the Latino, the Mexican surnames, and they become more white. And I think in that sense, and on top of that, my family by and large is fair skinned. And so I think there's this idea like we tend to identify more with the hegemony and fight or believe in those causes, right? Like we talk about conservative versus progressive and all of that. And like in a political sense, you can make an argument. I would make an argument that we need to be as progressive as possible. But, I have family members who I care very deeply for who are conservative to the bone. And like, it's so mind numbing having conversations with them and trying to help them see a different perspective. Cause it's like, listen, I understand that you think that it's not us, right? Like you talk about we were talking about the caravan earlier, and you're scared of the caravan. These are our family, right? Like if they're coming from Mexico or Central America, like that's our family. And like to like reclaim that heritage is really hard. And so I think assimilation tends to be easier than integration. And I think that goes both ways. I think it was Paul who was mentioning the Selena movie that, it definitely is the case that I don't always know who I fit in with. And so I'm not white enough to be white. I'm not Mexican enough to be Mexican. So where am I in that line? And now that I live in a big city, I feel more urban, so I feel closer to the Caribbean Latinos in my city, right? And so like even then I'm kind of losing that Mexican-ness and understanding more of the like Caribbean Latino experience and finding that I identify a lot more with that. And so like for me it's really more of we are Latino, right? That's who we are. We have shared experiences, we have shared languages, like all of this. And so that's where we need to come together and get away from being so nationalistic and more, this is our ethnicity.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Chris was saying. When I first got here and, I didn't know the language, didn't know the culture, didn't even know where I was. I didn't know what Anaheim, was to California. That's where Disneyland is, and that's where the Rams used to play and all that. All I knew was that I was looked down upon because, I didn't speak English or I spoke Spanish. I looked different. I dressed different. so by now I've realized that it's you can assimilate. You can pick up on the rules, you can pick up on the customs and the language, but without needing to uproot your beliefs, your likes, or your ideas. It's kind of like Du Bois says, this dual conscious. You have to, in order to exist in both worlds per se, you still have to maintain a connection and the identity with both of those worlds. Today, if I had known that, I was gonna basically do a 180 where I come here as a Mexican and then I become Mexican American, but they're basically trying to erase my identity, what I grew up with, my belief system, to now circling around and saying, wait, nowadays everyone is saying it's okay to dress like that, it's okay to listen to that music, it's okay if you like Mexican food, or if you speak Spanish. I mean, even in public nowadays, I kind of don't want to speak Spanish because, again, it was ingrained in my head back in the 90s, don't speak Spanish, you're kind of like less, you're inferior if you speak Spanish. Our cultures are very rich, with knowledge, which can be useful in regardless of the area where we decide to live. And that's something that I keep telling myself that it's okay to kind of, know a little bit of both worlds and use it depending on where I'm at.
Thank you. And lastly, Daniel, as for closing.
I think when it comes to assimilation and integration, again, for me, my experience has never been having to assimilate into a traditional American melting pot or into a big city. Growing up where I grew up, again, population was majority Hispanic, majority Mexican American. There was never a need to integrate myself or assimilate into a culture that I wasn't aware of or that I didn't feel like I didn't belong in. So for me, it came natural that these are my people, this is what the rest of the world is. So when people talk about racism or these big topics, I mean, I could say that I never experienced it, and to this day, I can say I still haven't. I like to think I'm educated. I mean, I've had my bachelor's, my master's, working on a second master's already. I know what I bring to the table, and I'm confident in my abilities. And I feel like I could stand up with the best of them in any culture or race. So for me, I think being sheltered allowed me to be confident in my abilities, where I never had to doubt myself, where I feel like maybe if I grew up in a bigger city with multiple races, I would have maybe reclused myself in or would have doubted myself and my abilities. But because I never had to deal with that, my assimilation integration, I think, is a very smooth transition for me because of my upbringing and what my environment was. So I feel like there's pros and cons to my environment that I grew up in. But I definitely think that because of that environment, it allowed me to not become so self-conscious about my language or my voice or my tone or my dialect, because this is what I was always around.
With that said, that is all the time that we have. Thank you everyone for joining us. For everyone at home, make sure you like the video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on all our social media outlets at Latin_entertainment. Also, you can listen to us on various podcast platforms that vary from Anchor, Spotify, Apple Music, and much more. Additionally, check us out on our website for various features that promote the Latin American diaspora on Abya Yala at www.latinentertainment.org. Stay tuned as we have more episodes ahead on this show, Conversamos.